Hello vinyl community, it's Matt here again. I wanted to make a real quick follow-up to my last video where I talked about the importance of not discouraging people who perhaps have lower end turntables, especially young people where perhaps that's what they can afford or they were given a turntable, etc. So I had a kind of a different take on it. I was thinking about it. Anyway, here it is. Um, I was thinking that there've always been lower end turntables, always. I mean, you go back decades, they had them in the 60s and the 70s. They were always cheap record players that you could buy. And compared to the nicer, more expensive stuff, they weren't very good. But nobody seemed to think much about it. It wasn't, this is before my time, admittedly, but I don't think it was a real big thing. People didn't make a big deal about, oh, well, you've only got a, $50 turntable, whatever the costs were back then, adjusted for inflation. Um, Whereas I've got a $300 turntable. People didn't sneer at you like that. It was just because I think that the vinyl was king. Vinyl was the predominant source for music, particularly for most people. And so, big deal. Okay, some people had nicer turntables, some people had lower end turntables. It was just the way it was. And then something happened in the 80s that I think started to change this, and that was the release of the compact disc. Now, for a little while, that was still kind of a niche product. CDs were expensive. The CD players were very expensive, certainly compared to buying a turntable. And so, for a while, for better or worse, CDs were kind of seen as that was the audiophile format, the CD. And there are various reasons why it could be considered superior to vinyl. There's some reasons why vinyl might be superior. I don't want to get into all that. But I think in terms of public perception, and in realities, in terms of the cost, the CD was the audiophile product to have in the 80s. And again, a lot of that goes down to the fact that it was so expensive, yada, yada, yada. Now, that started to change. Um, Definitely by the early 90s, and probably maybe just a little bit before that, where CDs became king. CDs overtook vinyl in sales. I don't know the year off the top of my head. I probably should have looked that up before I started making this video, but I think it was, I want to say probably around, I'm going to say 1990. It's probably give or take a year or two, but anyway. CDs overtook vinyl in sales, and now CDs were now considerably cheaper, and CDs were the music for the masses. It was pretty cheap to buy a CD player. It was cheap to buy CDs, and so now CDs were kind of the format that everyone had. And certainly by the time you get to, let's say, the end of the 90s, hardly anyone had records anymore. Just wasn't a thing. Everyone had CDs. If you were kind of one of the last holdouts when it came to vinyl, that vinyl was now the audiophile product, because it became rarer and rarer for albums to be pressed to vinyl. If they were pressed to vinyl, they were very limited runs, and maybe they press a couple of thousand of them, but they would press tens or hundreds of thousands of CDs in comparison. So vinyl became this sort of exclusive club, almost a little bit like how CDs have been in the early to mid 80s, where vinyl was now the format of choice for the audiophile. If you were into vinyl, certainly by the 2000s, and like I said, really by the late 90s, if you were into vinyl, well, you were some kind of big audiophile, and you wouldn't have CDs. No, vinyl was where it was at. So it really flipped, and vinyl, because so few people now had turntables, vinyl became this sort of, like I say, like a very exclusive club. And people get very protective when they think they're in some when they think they're in something special. And I think that once vinyl started to make a comeback, which the 2010s, a lot of people started to feel threatened by that. They really did, in a way that they weren't threatened 20, 30 years earlier, when you could buy cheap turntables back then. Nobody batted an eyelid. But suddenly it's a big deal right now. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that And again, you've had vinyl that's been considered, um, let's say for a couple of decades, really, this very high-end audiophile. Not many people have it. This is our secret society type of thing. And now you've got a lot of people, especially young people, trying to break into that. And they need some kind of an entry point. And it happens to be, for a lot of people, with the likes of Crosley's, and there's other, Victrola and Ion, and I think Jensen makes some like that too. The suitcase turntables, or the turntables that are made to look older than they really are. Lower end turntables, sure, but everybody needs a way into the hobby. But again, I don't really want to rehash that. It's more about the now people feel very insecure by there's this influx of sort of new blood, as it were, coming into this hobby, and I really think psychologically that's a big part of it, because some of these same people who have a problem with lower end turntables today would have had no problem with it 30 years ago or 40 years ago. They may not admit that, I don't know, but that's my belief. They feel threatened by it now because vinyl was this niche audiophile product almost for a little while once CDs became king, and now vinyl came back, and people don't like change, and so they've become used to this sort of sneering, snobbish, looking down on people. Well, I'm into vinyl, and those CDs that you like, yeah, please. But there's another thing as well that I want to bring up, as that's related to this, and that is to do with the gap. So there's a very large gap between, and this goes back to CDs as well. There's a very large gap between a lower end turntable and a higher end turntable in terms of audio quality, fidelity, the wow and flutter on the turntable, a lot of different factors, but there's a pretty wide gap there, and what you can hear with your ears in terms of just the audio quality. A $50 to $100 turntable versus a $500 turntable, this is a $1,000 turntable, etc. That gap, though, with CDs was very small. The difference between a $1,000 CD player and your average, let's say, $100 CD player, well, the differences, sure, but the differences were small. They really were. Assuming that you had them hooked up to the same speakers, same setup and everything, the difference in audio quality was fairly minimal because it's all digital. There's no physical, you're not dragging a stylus through the grooves on a record. And so I think that's part of it too, is that the sneering didn't exist really with the CD, maybe a little bit, but because, again, the difference was fairly small in terms of sound quality between a cheap CD player, again, assuming you had the same speakers and the same setup, and a more expensive CD player. That difference is a lot bigger with vinyl, and I think that's part of it as well. Anyway, that's all I just wanted to throw out there. I'm sure I'll get some people who are saying that I'm completely off base and that 40 years ago everyone looked down on the basic cheap turntables, and maybe, I don't know. That's just my theory, my opinion. I'm entitled to it. So. All right, that's all I got, guys. Thank you as always for watching, and until next time, bye bye.